Hey everyone, and thanks for joining us for our daily semifinal recap show. It is the final day at Strength and Depth. We now know who is going to the CrossFit Games. We have Brian Friend here to recap all the drama, the action. There was so much happening. Another exciting weekend for sure, though.
Oh man, I mean, this was all three divisions probably as tight as it's been. It seems like in most other semis, there's been one or two divisions that are really close and one that's not so exciting. Strength and Depth hit a home run on all three in terms of drama on the last day.
It really did. And we're going to get through all of the divisions, but I want to start with teams just off the bat. Oslo Navy Blue, dominating fashion, 6 for 6. When we're looking at them competing at the CrossFit Games this summer, how tight is that competition between them, Mayhem, and Reykjavik really going to be?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty obvious in the team division right now that there's like a separation happening, and there's these few teams around the world that have been extremely impressive. And in the case of those three, the way that they've been impressive is by winning every event at the semifinal, regardless of who's in their field and who they're competing with. And I think we even put an article up kind of comparing their stats against each other. Obviously, they only did two of the same events, but I think that in both of those events, they were like all six of their scores were top 10 in the world. And really outside of the lifting from Oslo, they were like the best scores in the world. So you're really, looking at that the best teams, at least on the workouts we can compare them against. And then the other thing impressive is just the margins of victory on the rest of the events. I think on like 6 of the 8 events where they were actually finishing, or maybe it was 10 of the 12 other events, Oslo, Mayhem, and Reykjavik were winning against the entire field by a minute or more. I mean, it was like just a dominating performance. I do think there's a couple other teams that will be in the mix when Madison finally rolls around, but for sure, these are the top 3 that if you want to get on that podium, you're going to have to unseat at least one of them.
Okay, so the drama that was really happening was between the other teams. I want to just pull up, I did take a screenshot of the team leaderboard after event 5 today. What was happening? There were a couple teams just outside the cusp, but the race was really between a couple teams here.
Yeah, this actually is kind of a great snapshot to look at because Trondheim, who's in 7th here after event 5, they were in 3rd to start this event. But if you look all the way over on the right, they got a 15th, their worst event up to that point, and it bumped them down from 3rd to 7th. And so basically knowing that that's variable positioning in just one event, every team in there, and I mean, Sarpsborg is only 10 points ahead of 80-20. Those teams 2 through 7 all still felt like they were going to have to fight for those game spots despite how good their weekends has been, because all of these teams have been fairly consistent and very close and exchanging placements workout to workout all weekend long.
So then what happened? Because then if we ultimately look at the leaderboard after event 6, how did these teams shake out? And what was the separator between whether a team qualified for the games from the semifinal or is just outside?
Yeah, I mean, if we just look all the way to the right, obviously Oslo takes first, but the next 5 teams that needed these finishes take second, take third, fifth, second, fourth, fifth. I mean, they were the next, and they're the next 5 teams to finish, and only really Mayflower of that group had a bad event finish and fell out. So then it came down to the points, and the points were literally as close as it could be. You had the team in 4th, 430, the team in 5th, 430, and the team in 6th, 425. And then the team division, every spot is 5 points, which means that Nordic only needed one better placement on any event across the entire weekend to potentially, pass one of those teams, depending on if they gain points against them, or at least be in that tie. And when you look at their event finishes, we see Trondheim 3 seconds, we see Aylesbury a second and a fourth, and we see Nordic a second and a third. So one more spot would have got them the tiebreak by 1 place in any workout over Aylesbury. And that's how close the margins were.
So when we look at the teams that ultimately did qualify for Madison, are there any that we haven't really talked about that we should know about before they get there this summer?
I mean, it's really notable that 3 Norwegian teams qualify here. 1 Norwegian team qualified from Lowlands in week 1, the second team from Oslo, in fact. And that means that 4 of the 10 teams, 40% of the teams representing Europe at the CrossFit Games are coming out in Norway. And, especially in the women's side of competition, Iceland has seemed to be like the dominating force. We've obviously had Kristen Holte be amazing from Norway over a long period of time, but to have 4 teams from one country in a place where CrossFit is as well spread as Europe is a very, very notable thing.
I'm curious, would you say that this was the most competitive field for teams out of all the semifinals?
Yeah, possibly. I mean, the teams that just missed out are really good. Nordic Original and Mayflower are both very good teams. There was also a Butcher's Lad team that withdrew from this competition, and another team, Oslo Underdogs, that withdrew from this competition before it began. That I think would have even potentially factored into the equation. So this is one of those divisions. When you look at the semifinals and you think, man, these, like, maybe, people talk a lot about, should we have different game spots out of Europe for women or men, but we haven't really talked about it much on the team side. And I'm looking just at the depth of competitors team wise here and also at Lowlands. And I'm really wondering how they stack up against some of the teams that just missed out, or even some of them that just snuck in North America. Maybe a study for another day.
To just add it to the list of things to do now that we are just about done covering semifinals. For the women's field, the top 5, it seemed like they didn't shift too much, but it was those people right outside of the cusp that we were waiting to see if they would punch their tickets back to Madison, a couple of veterans that didn't qualify. But before we get to that, let's then take a look at the women's leaderboard after event 5 today. Again, some shift ups. What was it about that event, especially knowing that every second counts with those legless rope climbs and then sprinting to the finish with these athletes?
Yeah, the legless rope climb event is looming at every one of these semifinals as a kind of make or break, and more so for the women than the men. But in this case, we saw someone like Sam Briggs do what she needed to do, take a fourth place finish and reassert herself into the conversation heading into the final event. In the meantime, Katrin Davidsdottir, despite obviously improving dramatically on legless rope climb since the last time she did this workout, only finished in 18th place, and that dropped her all the way down to 10th. The thing about these women heading into the final is that 10th place was only about 40 points or so out of a qualifying spot. And we've seen twice as big a margin as that be overcome in one event already this semifinals, and certainly others that have been notable as well. So everyone that was qualifying for this last heat, because of just that jostling after event 5, still in the conversation for a possible game spot with that final event to go.
Right. And then when we look at the final event, we had people on the line that really needed to have a good performance, but ultimately it just wasn't enough. And specifically, both Katrin and Sam, they gave everything they had on this event. Katrin looked better than she did all weekend long. Sam, she was fighting to stay alive, but ultimately neither of them qualified for the CrossFit Games.
Yeah, and actually, I put up a poll this morning. Will Sam, Katrin, neither or both make it to the games? And it was pretty split field, but certainly a lot of votes for neither. And this was a little bit surprising. I would have thought that one of them would have got in. I think that they both had pretty good days here. And what we talked about it early in the weekend with Sam Briggs, where that first day, she took a third and a ninth, and it looked pretty good. But I was just wondering if maybe a few extra points here or there might have been what she needed. And in the end of the weekend, 10 points out, sure enough, a little bit better on those early events might have been the ticket for her. In the case of Katrin, I think it really just comes down to those two 18th place finishes. And we've seen this, throughout the history of regionals and semifinals before, where when the programming comes out, and if you happen to have a deficiency in a certain thing, and in this case for her, it's kind of the same thing, just the ring muscle ups, upper body pulling, and the legless rope climbs, upper body pulling, that provide those two bad event finishes that offset first, third, fourth, and 11th, which was a great finish for her in the lifting event. So that's just how it is now, that the fields are a little bit better. They're a little bit deeper, and those mistakes, if you don't have them, dialed in well enough, can expose you in the end.
When we look at athletes like Katrin and Briggs, who obviously have been to the games several times, do you think that either of them have a shot to get their ticket through the last chance qualifier?
Well, it sounds like Sam's not going to compete in it, and I think that makes sense for her being 40. It's the last semifinal weekend, so it's really close up to the LCQ. She said that she'd worked really hard just to prepare her body for this, and I think and she's going to try to help Emma McQuaid get ready for the games. Plus, she has a Fire Academy coming up, so makes sense in the case of Sam. Most of the time, I'm critical of the athletes who don't want to do the LCQ because that's what it's there for. These are competitive regions, and look, Christy Aramo got in through the LCQ and placed top 10 at the games last year. So everyone who's in there should still feel like their season is alive and want to show up and fight whatever, gets thrown at them that weekend. So for Katrin, I don't know. Online's not been her best format historically. She's usually not as good in the open as she is at the regionals, and not as good at regionals as she is at the games. And this is almost a step backwards from semifinals in terms of like programming. It's less events if it's the same as last year, and the format being online instead of live. So I would say that probably not the most favorable format for her.
Looking at some of the other athletes, we had Dalstrom, Mcquaid, Davidsdottir. They all battled all weekend long. And though both women have, you know, when we're looking at them, are we surprised by the way that they placed? I'll bring up the leaderboard and just overall their performances. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that most people were probably on, except for Patrick, of course, were probably on Emma Mcquaid to win this competition, coming off the win at Wodapalooza. But not a lot of people were talking about Turi. I had put her in the 5 spot prior to this, just kind of saying, she's done it before. She'll probably do it again. But to finish third and be, 7 points out of second, really, really strong performance. That the lifting was okay. Everything else top 5, or I guess the 7th on the last workout. And 2 event wins. So really a great performance for Turi. I think this is probably the best feeling she'll have going into the games in terms of being competitive amongst the women in Europe. But really, this weekend to me was about Jacqueline Dahlstrom as far as the women's field goes. To win a semifinal is pretty tough. And you look at her event finishes, and they're the most consistent of the group, right? 2nd through 6th on every workout, whether it was a long one, a short one, high skill, whatever. She managed, and, she managed that barbell pretty well when she needed to throughout the weekend. So for a smaller girl that's usually favorable in bodyweight stuff, she seemed to be more well-rounded and complete as an athlete this week than we've seen before. Both Emma and Turi got the best of her at the games last year. Jacqueline gets the best of them here. So kind of an interesting story to follow going into Madison between these 3.
How about Elisa Fuliano, her getting that final spot in the top 5?
Yeah, so similarly to our friend Enrico Zanoni from Italy, I've reached out to the Italian CrossFit liaison for Italy over there.
We're trying to learn more about them.
Yeah, and she's I don't think that it doesn't sound like she's really all invested into the sport like most of the professional athletes are right now. She's pretty much been doing CrossFit since 2019, and she has done a few competitions, including placing 5th at the IF3s earlier this year, but she pretty much works full time and then trains after work, and she's found a way to make that work. So I'm, try to learn some more about her heading into the games now that she's done this well. But, one of these athletes that kind of surprised everyone this weekend. And when the pressure was on the last day, she didn't falter. 9th and a 10th doesn't maybe look that great, but she didn't have anything worse than a 12th all weekend. And, she did enough to get in against a pretty tough field.
Anything else about the women before we move on to the men?
I mean, we mentioned every other qualifier, so I might as well give Solvik some love. She was very steady this weekend, and when she needed to, she put in a 3rd place performance on the last event.
Looked great.
A little up and down, a 1st, a 2nd, a 3rd to go with an 11th, 12th, and 16th. But that's not the worst thing at the games. If you can have some top finishes at the games, you can, gain points against most of the other women that'll be in kind of that middle grouping. So I'll be curious to see where she filters out in her first year. And, even if she's between like 15th and 30th with a few good events when the games come around, that's not bad for the first year of the games. And I'll be definitely curious to see how she can do. And even though Katrin misses out, we still get 2 women from Iceland to the games in this field,
which is exciting for everyone. Moving to the men now. After event 5 today, this is what the leaderboard looked like. Brian Christoph Horvath, he wins 2 for a 3rd overall, 2nd for a 3rd overall, rather. He still was trying to creep up to that top 5. He was in 8th. What are your thoughts on that performance?
Yeah, I mean, I think Christoph may have wanted to win that event, but ultimately there were a couple of guys in Henrik and Willie who've just been, better than most all weekend long. So taking the 3rd there is very respectable, and it kept him in the hunt. I mean, that last event is it was going to be a dogfight for the guys. I think you'd see guys do well on the bike, others who do well on the burpees, and then would come down to the barbell. So I've definitely thought that this was good enough to keep him in the mix heading into the final. But when you're in 8th place like that, a lot of it just depends on the guys ahead of you. And if they do what they need to do, then it's not going to matter.
I mean, then we look at somebody like Hapalainen. How do you think that he is going to fare against other competitors once he gets to the games? He finished second overall after the end of the weekend.
Yeah, I mean, Hapalainen, Hude, and Kerevis will both ultimately be making their second consecutive trip to the games. They were all in the same rookie class last year. Henrik and Hude made it into the top 20. We don't know the game's format this year, but I think regardless, both of them will be looking to improve upon their finishes last year. And what I saw from Henrik this week is that he's, similarly to Solvik, he's got these high highs. Like he won 2 events and he looked really good doing it, but he's got a couple, the 11th and then the 18th on the last workout that make me wonder, okay, what's missing still from his game, in totality, and how much of an impact will that have on the workout styles that we'll see in Madison compared to in a regional format. So I think Henrik has improved without a doubt this year. He looks very good and controlled. I still think that there are things coming along for him, and those will probably be exposed at the games, but that doesn't mean that he can't improve on his finish from last year.
All right, and then moving into what the leaderboard looked like after event 6, or at least we'll look at event 6. A lot to dissect here, but let's start with Hude. He had a slow start, strong finish. What are your general thoughts about his chances at the games this summer after so many up and downs this weekend?
Yeah, I thought his interview afterwards was interesting, how he said he was like kind of shocked and I don't think he used this word, but almost embarrassed by his 19th on workout 1. I think that really caught him off guard just based on the way he was talking about it. He's a very methodical athlete. He likes to stick to the plan. And it seems like despite that disappointment in event 1, he was able to do so. Like we talked about with Hapalainen and Solvik, when you have finishes of first, second, and second, like those go a long way in terms of creating a points gap against the field. And that's when you can afford to have a workout or two that's a little bit worse. That was exactly the situation for him. And, he winds up 3rd. I think that 1st through 5th wouldn't really matter too much for him. He's just going to be happy to go back to the games. And I think that like Hapalainen, he'll have to work hard to improve that placement, because the men's field at the games this year is starting to look pretty stout.
So who did you have ahead, Hapalainen or Hude?
Oh man, yeah, this was crazy. I had Hapalainen. No, I had Hapalainen in a bet with my friend Nico, who's from Denmark and a friend of Andre's, and it came down to 3 points. It's one placement on the leaderboard at the end of the day, so as close as it could have been, but I did get him on this one.
Okay, so how do you think that they will fare once we actually do get to Madison, especially when you're looking at 15 events or up to 15 events? Maybe we'll have more this year. Who really knows yet?
Nico's already texted me. I think we're going to run the bet back.
What's on the line?
That's between us.
Okay. That's fair. Okay, let's talk about some of the other athletes and how this really played overall. What were your thoughts about Koski on this workout and his chances in the last chance qualifier?
Yeah, I mean, what Koski did in the final event today is like, that's what I expect from a veteran who's been around for a long time. He wasn't in the lead early. He just picked people off in the middle, and he kind of put the hammer down in the last round. Hude ended up beating him in the heat, and unfortunately for him, Petey Savage ended up beating him from the heat before. Because if Savage hadn't had that good of a time, he would have taken second to Hude, 4 points more, and you can look at the leaderboard and see what that would have meant.
Okay, so the overall winner, Willie George, there he is in all of his glory at the top. What are your thoughts about him once he gets to Madison?
Yeah, I mean, it was pretty tight between him and Hapalainen for most of the weekend, but come that final event, he's able to once again put a top 5 finish on the board, his 5th of the weekend, whereas Hapalainen, was struggling a bit on that one. And then you see the points gap is fairly significant, 55-point gap. Usually when I'm talking about guys that are top 5 at the games, I'm looking at 550 points, and top 10 at the games, I'm looking at, you need 500 plus points. So Willie's in that conversation, I think, for a top 10 spot at the games again this year. He hasn't been there since 2018, where he was 9th. And definitely still have to answer some questions about the shoulder and whether he can hold up over the duration of a games weekend. But from what we saw this week, Mads Jacobsen said it on the call, and I'm gonna have to echo it here. I feel like Willie is definitely back in the conversation, and that's one of the reasons why, amongst many this year, that men's field down 15, maybe even 20 spots is going to be very, very competitive.
So what are your overall thoughts on the depth of field that we have in Europe, especially just looking alone at this leaderboard and seeing how close that point spread is, from 5th, 6th, 7th?
Yeah, ultimately tie on 4th and 5th between Yorgos and Guillaume, and then Koski only 2 points back. So it's very tight. And we can remember back to Lowlands where it was a similarly tight race between several athletes on the bubble there. And in both cases, we see a guy like Guillaume Briant or Enrico Zanoni get into the games as a rookie. And the person that's missing out is, an Adrian Mundweiler or a Jona Koski, who's a perennial games athlete. And so it's echoing the feeling of semifinals at large, where we have new faces coming in, battling with people who've been around for a while. And I think, a lot of attention has been given to how good the European women have been for a long time. But I don't know that there's necessarily how much depth there is relative to how good they are, because it's the same faces over and over. Now on both sides in Europe, the men are elevating as well, and there seems to be better overall performances at the games and a lot of contenders on the bubble. So I think that Justin Berg actually talked about it on the broadcast a little bit, that that is something that CrossFit's working on, having a conversation about what's the best way to allocate spots globally for the CrossFit Games. And I think there's a good chance that we'll see a different format for that next year, and hopefully it's a little bit more performance-based. How the continent's fair in competition instead of something like a sign-up rate.
Overall thoughts on who qualified for the CrossFit Games through strength and depth this weekend?
I mean, it's a pretty good field. I don't know that we have any podium threats out of strength and depth on the men's or women's side. We certainly have one on the team side, but there's a lot of men and women, I would say 3 or 4 in each division, that are going to be pushing for 10 to 15 spots at the games. And when you're in that mix, that means that you're factoring in points wise on a lot of workouts. So I think that this strength and depth field helps round out some men's and women's fields that are already looking pretty good.
All right, Brian, more people qualifying for the CrossFit Games. We have one more semifinal to wrap up the weekend.
Almost there.
So we're almost there. We're going to go finish watching Atlas Games, but awesome to see strength and depth finish strong. Another set of athletes going to the games, and we'll catch up with you later.
All right. Thanks, Lauren.